Hello, everybody. Earlier this week, we did a show with my old friend John Taplin. Went down to LA to talk to him about American culture and what he believes is the imminent renaissance. Taplin, of course, is the author of The Magic Years, Seen from a Rock and Roll Life. He was the original tour manager for Bob Dylan and was very much in the center of things in the 1960s, the glory years. But he remarked in our conversation that American culture has gone profoundly stale. He cited an experience he had earlier this year. I had the same experience, actually. He went to a Bruce Springsteen concert, rock and roll star now in his mid-70s. And all the audience he suggested was over 60. And when Because the Night came on, the 1977 song, which was written by Bruce Springsteen and popularized by Patti Smith, everyone in the audience got up and became immensely nostalgic about their youth. They remembered the past, but they weren't looking forward. This theme of nostalgia and a cultural crisis or a cultural paralysis is developed by my guest today, a very distinguished American cultural music journalist, David Rowell. He used to write for the Washington Post. Now he's the senior editor at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and he's the author of The Endless Refrain, Memory, Nostalgia, and the Threat to New Music. David is joining us from his home in North Carolina, just outside Chapel Hill. David, congratulations on the new book. It's an important book. It seems obvious, and yet it's always the most obvious arguments that aren't made. What's happened? Why have we become so stuck in the past when it comes to music?
Well, I think it's a few things. I do think that the internet keeps us pretty stuck in this mindset that everything that came before was better. I think I just see so many Facebook posts and Instagram images, and it's something from the 70s or it's a concert from the 80s. And I think that COVID had something to do with it. I think that for a lot of people, the future was hard to imagine suddenly with COVID. And so people said, well, if there's not going to be a future, because we didn't know what we didn't know then I think a lot of people went back to the catalog that they knew and got re-immersed in that music from their youth because it felt good to go back and think about simpler times. But I also think that...
Well, let me just jump in before you get to that. I have to admit, I think your book and your argument is an important one. I'm not convinced by either of those. I mean, everyone always throws in COVID, but the Rolling Stones and Bruce Springsteen and all these other dinosaur bands were touring and popular before COVID. Sure. And then everyone always blames the internet for everything. I mean, really, can we blame the internet for nostalgia? Isn't the internet just a mirror of who we are? And we go on and we make our arguments. We wax nostalgically, but that's not the internet's fault.
Well, here's what I would say. On the internet, there are endless places where they're asking you to rank albums from bands who peaked when you still got TV Guide at the grocery store checkout line. There are always lists of great guitarists, and they're always before this century. So there's so many places, particularly on music websites, that are making us look back at music as it was versus music as it is now. Now, of course, there's a ton of new music on the internet now, but a lot of people are so overwhelmed because it's an endless sea of music, and they don't know where to really even begin to go look for it. And so it's easier to stay in that comfort place of music that we used to know.
It's chicken and egg, David, though, cause and effect. It's hard to separate the two. Taplin's talked about the same thing. He said in the 60s, when the Beatles came out with a new album, it automatically went to #1. Everybody listened. Everyone listened to the same radio, a handful of radio stations, and watched the same television networks. And now we have this fragmentation of media where everyone listens and watches different things. But what came first, the technology or the culture? It's hard to separate the two.
Well, so here are two indicators that I spent some time with on the book. It is a huge time for tribute bands right now. Tribute bands make up a very significant part of the live concert industry. And what does that say? But people increasingly want to hear music from the past. You go to see a tribute band, and it's a surefire way to not hear any new music at all. And so there's that. And also, there is now the rise of music holograms. And so what that is dead musicians who are being brought to life digitally, and they're appearing on screen, generally with live musicians around them. And that is just one more way to experience music from the past. So I do think that there are very real indicators that we are increasingly wanting to stay with the music that we knew and grew up with.
But David, when I was growing up, there was such a thing, I don't know if we still have the term, classical music, which kids aren't keen on, and then they grow up and become keen on, excusing the pun on keen on.
Yeah.
The Beethovens, the Mozarts, the Mahlers, the Shostakoviches. There was no reason why you couldn't have classical music or jazz music or R&B or the blues and also have new music. The two aren't necessarily incompatible, are they?
Well, no, but I'm just telling you, and this book is about what I'm seeing all around me. And so here's just a couple of examples, if I can. So I'm kind of equidistant between two McDonald's, okay? McDonald's, you would think, would serve basically the broadest group of patrons of any restaurant on the planet. You have young and old and black and white and brown. And so these two McDonald's that I'm referring to, one plays only 70s music from the minute it opens to the minute it closes, and the other one plays only 80s music. And so you think, well, why is that? Here we are almost a quarter into this new century, and it's because we have a relationship to that old music that increasingly blocks music from this century from entering the public sphere in the way that old music has. Because like when I was a teenager, if I was hanging out at McDonald's in the 80s, it would be the equivalent of them playing Cab Calloway and the Andrews Sisters and Bing Crosby and Duke Ellington. I'm pretty sure as a teenager, I would have had the wherewithal to say, are they playing Bing Crosby? And why would they? But now...
Well, but coming back to this, David, I take your point, but the market always speaks louder than words in some of these examples. And back in the 60s, you wouldn't have gone to if you'd been a McDonald's or some other chain, you'd have gone down the street to a place that was playing new music. The reality is that people want to hear this music for better or worse. You can't blame the people who control the sound system at the local McDonald's, can you?
Well, but so I talked to one of the operators at the McDonald's. The fact is that no one thinks anything of it to be hearing this music wherever we go. So, for example, I'm pretty sure I've never been to an automotive store of any kind or gone to get an oil change, which I'm not hearing the Steve Miller Band play. I've never been to Target and not heard Men at Work. Men at Work had 3 albums in the 80s, and then the band was finished. It's a ratio of old music in these contemporary times that to me doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it's so interesting, and there's so many different ways of going about it. I know a lot of, or some young people, I'm not going to name names here, people in their late teens and certainly in their 20s who love this stuff.
Yeah.
Now, back in my day, back in the 70s when I was growing up, the idea that you would have loved the same stuff as your parents was inconceivable. Yes. By definition, whatever your parents liked, you hated.
Right.
So it's not just who controls the sound system at McDonald's or what music comes up when you go to your auto repair shop, David.
Right.
There's something in the culture which means that the kids, and Tapscott's become an authority on this, the kids aren't rebelling anymore, or at least the idea of rebellion and music has been separated. So maybe you can be a rebel, maybe a cultural rebel, maybe even a right-wing cultural rebel, and like Donald Trump or some sort of unpleasant organization, but it's not manifested through music. In the 60s and 70s, music was the place where culture was made. And everybody from Taplin to Kurt Anderson, who was on my show about 10 years ago writing about this, music is no longer relevant for some bizarre reason.
Well, the thing that I struggle to come to terms with is, so there's so much new television and people binge on new shows they're constantly watching, and there's a ton of new television out there. A lot of people don't go to the movie theater anymore, but they're streaming new movies all the time. They listen to new podcasts, but somehow when it comes to music, they're very content to hear music consistently from several decades ago. And it just, it's like no one sits around and watches Bewitched or F Troop all the time. Or you have a favorite movie and you maybe watch it a few times, but you don't watch it 3 or 4 times a week. So part of what this is about, I believe, is that we have a fixation with the music that that was playing when we were growing up. Because when you're a teenager, everything is dramatic, right? I mean, and music was playing everywhere. I grew up with the rise of MTV, and so we were hearing those songs if we were sitting around the house watching, and we were constantly sitting around watching. But if those songs were on MTV, then they were also being played on pop radio. So the minute we left the house, if we went to putt-putt over the intercom, you're hearing the same songs. Or if you were hanging out at the pool and you had your boombox on, you were hearing the same songs. And so we formed an attachment to those songs back then that as we get older in life, we don't let ourselves form attachments to new music quite with the same kind of intensity. And increasingly, not only do we not form an intensity with the new music, but listening to new music becomes a much harder proposition. Now,
but isn't it also, David, about failing our generation, yours and mine, the boomer? Maybe you're slightly younger than the boomer, but the boomer generation failing to grow up, failing to recognize that when they go to a Bruce Springsteen concert and you have this 75-year-old billionaire prancing around on stage as if he's 18, and you have all these 60 and 70-year-old people in the audience singing Patti Smith's Because the Night, remembering that experience they had in 1977, that they're all upset. I have to admit, when I went to the Springsteen concert, and I grew up as a Springsteen fan, it really not only shocked me, but made me profoundly embarrassed to be there and to even acknowledge being a Bruce Springsteen fan. I don't mean to pick on him, but he's a particularly good example of this.
Well, can I ask, but why was that your feeling?
My feeling was because it's absurd. It's shameful that we haven't grown up, that we're still thinking of 1977 when we had that wonderful night of sex or drugs or alcohol.
Yeah.
And that we've failed to acknowledge that we're no longer in that moment, and that the narratives of our lives shouldn't be rooted in the 70s or the 80s.
Well, all right. So I'm going to give you another concert.
And I may be wrong. I mean, I'm open for you to. You've given this a lot more thought than me. Maybe I'm being particularly. I'm a rather intolerant person. Maybe I'm being particularly intolerant.
Well, I mean, I have my favorite groups that I will go see, and some of their best music was in the 70s. I mean, I think of that as just loyalty.
Why? Why would you be loyal to? I mean, again, I mean, pick on Bruce Springsteen, but the guy's music is based on him being from the working class, and yet this year Forbes announced that he's officially a billionaire. Why would I want to help Bruce Springsteen make more money when the tickets are several $100s?
Well, it depends on whether that music has become more important to you as you've gotten older or less important, I would say.
So what? Give me your example.
So this is a slightly different example, but it's an example of the larger point that I'm arguing. So recently, my wife and I went to see a band whose debut album was in 1986. They have had the same 4 band members the entire time, like clockwork. They put out an album every 2 years, and it is so consistent, and they're so great in concert. And so they had a new album, and they started off with a couple of older songs, and the singer said, so we have this new album that we're
What's the name of the band?
This was the Cowboy Junkies. And she said, we have this new album, we're really proud of it, and we would like to play something from it. And you could tell already that it was a discussion, and I'm not putting down the singer at all when I say this. My point was, she was very sheepish in talking about the desire to play new music. It was as if it was a negotiation of some kind. And so she said, so we're just going to play a few songs from that, and then we'll make it like a little mini set. We'll take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll play all the songs you expect to hear.
Yeah. So it's sort of almost a disloyalty that if you veer off the greatest hits,
that's it.
Then you're somehow disloyal to the past and to the whole point of being at this concert, which is a get together. So even the bands themselves are really tributes. You talk about the rise of tribute bands, but all bands, especially the older bands, are tributes to themselves.
Well, I'm aware of that argument. You look at the new Beatles song that came out this year, and it just seemed to me, and a lot of people maybe love that song, it seemed to me an exercise in reminding us about the Beatles' greatness. And I don't think we really needed that song. I understand that technology made it possible, but I don't really think of that as a Beatles song.
So David, coming back to my point, I'm not sure you really addressed that. Of music as the political and cultural motor, certainly of the 60s and even in the 70s, is it sort of the 60s overflowed into the 70s. We went from Woodstock to Altamont.
Right.
It no longer is, for better or worse, although, of course, and John talked about this, Taplin talked about the role of rap. What's happened here in terms of the endless refrain? Has politics left the stadium entirely, or is the political simply different in the 2020s from the 1970s?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think when we got to the 80s, the music was so much more about image and the look of the musicians. And I think the lyrical content, and I'm generalizing here, but I think that the lyrical content of the 80s was not very interested in ideas and politics, and there were exceptions. But I think it was just about what did the music look like and the rise of the video.
Right. But, in the 70s, we had punk, which was such a dramatic wake-up call to a fat pop and rock and roll music industry.
Right.
And it was enormously popular and enormously influential. Why haven't there been new kinds of punk since then?
Well, I think that it becomes easier to create a music that is familiar, and it becomes basically savvier to create that. That there are more risks involved with doing something that is less proven. I mean, a lot of the artists. I mean, I talked to experts about this. There are artists who create music, and it has the same tempo and it has the same instrumentation, the same lyrical kind of content, because if you're listening on Spotify, and basically these days Spotify is everything, the whole idea on being on Spotify is to not have a song or something that disrupts that zone that you're in. Spotify is about keeping you there as much as you can.
It's confirming your reality rather than changing it or challenging it.
Yes. And so if you're a musician and you know that you're going to get the most money by how much you keep listeners there in Spotify. Now, depending if you're an artist, you may say, hey, I don't care about that. But it is right to say there are some musicians who care greatly about that. And so it's all very calculated, to create a music that is going to not throw any curveballs,
But David, there are lots of young musicians who don't have anything to go back to. So what are young musicians doing? They're not all in tribute band.
Well, no, but the young musicians have a harder path than ever because they're fighting against a mentality that is less open than it has been in previous generations, or maybe ever. Because remember, part of it is we don't really have the the music industry infrastructure anymore. So on the one hand, you can put your music out on YouTube or stream it, and you don't need any of those trappings. But it goes back to the question I was getting at earlier, which was, but then how is someone expected to find it?
Well, they will always find it, as they will always find popular figures on social media. I mean, the promise of the internet was anyone could become a star overnight, and there have been, although it's very hard to develop a career. It just seems it's a particularly surreal moment, because on the one hand, everyone is angrier and angrier, more and more concerned with our politics, with our culture, with our alienation and loneliness, with this intergenerational war. And I think a lot of this is a generational war. And yet the anger is not being articulated through music, which it was in the 60s.
Yeah. No. I think that people want other outlets for that. And I think music is more removed from that. And I think that some bands and artists are aware of that and think that that comes with a lot of risks. And so
But
they
there's
don't.
always going to be risks. I mean, David, again, there's a new movie coming out, Christmas, A Complete Unknown, a biography of the film biography of Bob Dylan, which I think a lot of people are looking forward to, including myself.
Great.
I mean, he's, of course, the classic example of an old artist who remains very popular, although Dylan has made a career out of blowing himself up. And in fact, I think the movie will be partly about, I haven't seen it yet, but the movie is partly about his shift from acoustic to electric. So the great artists are, and that's why I actually don't think Bruce Springsteen is a great artist, that's another issue, have always made a habit of blowing themselves up.
But I think that we don't have much appetite for that anymore. So I saw Bob Dylan on tour this summer, and he was part of a festival. And so you could see that there was a great deal of anticipation. And so Bob Dylan starts playing, and what settles in pretty quickly is a realization for people that they don't recognize these songs. And they expected to hear the handful of hits they knew. And so now about 3 songs in, I saw a bunch of people on their phones who had put it down before he started. And then, and suddenly now there was a woman in front of me who just said, "Just shoot me." And it was clear that it just wasn't what she had thought.
I hope you shot her, David.
Well,
he should have been shot. Actually, I think his last album is one of the best pieces of work he's ever made. I mean, he's a remarkable artist as he keeps on reinventing himself.
My son turned to me at one point during the set and he said, "Has any musician ever given less of a shit than Bob Dylan?"
Yeah, and that's his brand. Although I saw him a couple of times last year, once in New Orleans, which was a great concert, and once in Santa Cruz. And I thought the audience, particularly in Santa Cruz, which was a very Northern Californian audience, well, they were mainly older people, but they certainly didn't want to hear the old hits, and they were more than happy for him to do the new stuff.
So this was the festival group that had an idea or an image of Bob Dylan, who might not have sought Bob Dylan out on his own, But to me, it was very telling, and they got up and left in hordes as the set went on.
Yeah, and he didn't care. It makes no difference to him.
No.
So what about the broader issue, David? Again, I don't want to keep on picking on Bruce. No, he can stand up for himself. We had David Maschiotro on the show recently. He's another cultural writer like you. He wrote a piece for Unheard called Bruce Springsteen is the Last American Liberal. But of course, even Bruce didn't help Kamala Harris win the election. Is there a sort of a generational or an ideological battle going on here between old liberals like Bruce Springsteen and the world of the 2020s, where his values, his worldview seems increasingly archaic?
Well, I don't know about archaic, but they definitely aren't touching the same. They're not hitting the same chord that they did at one time. I mean, where we are politically is very confusing for a lot of people, but I think the larger message was that we don't really care what musicians have to think about who we should vote for. I mean, remember there were stories and headlines that said if Taylor Swift endorses Harris, then that
Right,
that
exactly.
the
And Taylor
election.
Swift's an even better example. It made absolutely no difference.
Now that seems like an embarrassing notion.
Even worse, I'm guessing that Springsteen and Taylor Swift's support for Harris probably cost a vote.
That I can't speak to, but I'm just saying there was a time, I mean, Springsteen campaigned for John Kerry, and
Well, he lost as well, David.
similar results. And so I think that we are at a point where we want musicians to entertain us, and we don't want musicians necessarily tell us how to think.
Yeah, or maybe we want musicians to make us think in different ways. I mean, one of the interesting pieces about the latter part of the Harris campaign was apparently a lot of the money she spent went to these bands.
Right.
John Taplin told me that he talked to Grail Marcus, probably the Pope of music journalists, really brilliant writer,
Sure.
who argued with John. John doesn't agree, but Marcus told John that and I'd like to get Marcus actually on the show, he believes that the new rebellion is a support for Trump or Trumpian ideas. And eventually some of that music will come through. Remind me of that. I think he may have been from North or South Carolina, that musician who earlier this year created a bit of a media storm.
He's from Virginia.
All right. What was his name? What is his name?
Yeah, I can't remember.
We're both who sang a sort of a folk song about American nationalism, which caught fire and was very critical of. Was a lot of liberals were very critical of.
Well, so no, it wasn't about nationalism at all. It was a broader complaint about what was going on in America, and Republicans very much co-opted it and said, "Hey, he's speaking to us." And he really, as far as I can follow in the press, he really resented that. He felt like, well, I'm not a puppet for anyone. And
and he was against the sort of billionaire class. I mean, in retrospect, of course, with Trump's association with Musk, if he was a Trump person, he may no longer be. But that comes back, David, to the point that when that music came out, there was a lot of poo-pooing from coastal journalists saying, "Oh, how can anyone support music that seems maybe racist or questions the core liberal ideology of those coastal elites?" And perhaps that might be the future of music, that those types of acts will actually, or that type of music, that type of art will actually resonate with young people.
Well, I mean, but the pendulum is always going to eventually swing back. I mean, at least that's what modern history has taught us. But I mean, the country artists who, some of whom, not all of them, some of whom who write from a more conservative point of view, I mean, I think there was a lot of criticism. There was a country song called "Not in My," what was it? "Not in My Town" or something.
Yeah.
And kind of a thinly veiled notion of racism going on in that song, and that got a lot of attention and criticism, and so I think from the liberal point of view, there was a hope that kind of music was going to be drowned out. And I mean, there's a danger in affixing music to one side of the party or other. But I mean, to your larger point, the politicians who were very vocal spokespeople for the candidates this year, I mean, the liberals certainly took a beating.
Yeah, and I mean, you can have evil political ideologies and like good music or like valuable music. I mean, the Nazis played Wagner in the concentration camps, sometimes even in the death chambers. They played Beethoven, and certainly wasn't Beethoven's fault. But so there isn't necessarily a connection between fine art, great art, high art, and your political ideas, is there?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that there is still a great romanticizing of musicians in the 60s and the ways that they felt emboldened to address political issues. And we're pretty removed from that now.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell. One of the books that most influenced me this year was by the New York Times writer David Leonhardt. Ours was The Shining Future, which is about the death of the American dream, which he dates that death to 1968 and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. You wrote a novel about that, The Train of Small Mercies. I think it's your first book, was very well reviewed, a classic in its own way. I haven't read it, but I'm planning to read it in the next few weeks.
Oh, thanks.
When you wrote that and you go back to 1960, I'm not saying you necessarily conform to Leonhardt's thesis, but of course, 68 was a remarkable moment in the history of music. And that period between the late 60s and the mid 70s was a cultural high point. Is there a connection, in your view, between, if not the death of Bobby Kennedy, but the death of the dream? And this kind of cultural crisis that we continually experience, where we're frozen to the past?
Yeah, I mean, 1968 is one of the darkest, probably the second darkest time in American history, next to the Civil War. And just because so many politicians had been killed in that 5-year span, and basically, particularly for the African American community, there's this notion that any politician that stood up for them was going to be silenced. And so, but so what the assassination of Kennedy gives way to is the rise of Nixon and Watergate, and that strain of American conservatism and power that ultimately goes, we have one term with Carter, but then goes to 3 terms between Reagan and Bush. And so the assassination of Robert Kennedy, we absolutely can feel the effects of that today, most definitely.
I mean, the other thing is, and you've done a lot of thinking about this, of course, RFK was a remarkable figure.
Yeah.
His son is also a remarkable figure. He's supposed to play a role in the new Trump administration, RFK Jr., the third child of Bobby Kennedy. He has a very different view of the world, a conspiratorial one. He's had a history of drug addiction, of enormous struggle. Is that conspiratorial way of looking at the world, David, can that be manifested in music? Is there a conspiracy school of musical genre? Maybe that would be the way to sell some records these days.
That's an interesting question. I myself am unaware of such a genre. And if we don't have that in music, then I would say that is a nice thing that we have avoided so far. Music doesn't have to be.
Why is it a nice thing? That's how most. I'm not suggesting that these people are right, but isn't that the way to tap the energy, the imagination of people? Is to not sing and write about things that are dead or irrelevant?
Through dishonesty and
yeah, I guess. I mean, if all conspiracy is, I guess, is dishonesty, then you're right. But
yeah.
a way of being suspicious of what appears to be ontological truth.
Well, I mean, cynicism. I mean, there's always been cynicism in American music, but and a distrust of government to some extent, a distrust of trends in society. But I would just suggest that what RFK Jr. represents goes well beyond skepticism.
Yeah, his tribute band to his father is probably not very accurate. So maybe we no record executive should be signing up RFK. Well, Trump's already signed him up, so he's already gone. Finally, David, in all seriousness, John Taplin, as I said, is writing a book about what he calls, or what he hopes to be, the renaissance of music and culture in America of the late 20s, 2030s. Are you at all hopeful? I mean, your thesis in this important new book is about memory nostalgia and this idea that nobody wants new music. We're hostile to it. We're almost embarrassed with it. Do you have any hope? Is it going to come with a new generation? Are there going to be new genres? I mean, we talked a little bit about hip hop and rap, which seem to have the most energy these days.
Yeah. Well, so I should say, so I wrote the book as an alarm bell because it worries me greatly about where we are in our musical taste, and it does have a very real consequence for the new music that's being played today in terms of it being heard and it being given the same kind of chance as music from the past. I mean, one of the things that keeps me worried is, so all these musicians that you and I have been talking about, Springsteen and Dylan and so many others, have been selling their back catalogs in recent years for tens of millions, hundreds of millions.
That's why Bruce is a billionaire now.
Yeah,
he sold his catalog to Sony for $500 million.
Well, they've sold their music to venture capitalists. And so what that means is we are going to be, if we think we hear that music a lot today, we're going to be hearing that music in ways we can't even imagine. And with the frequency and repetition that I worry is just going to be numbing, because if you're spending all that money to acquire those back catalogs, you intend to use that. You intend to commercialize that as much as possible, or else why would you have bought it? Not to just sit on it and keep it in a vault. So that music is going to be coming at us in all kinds of ways. That does worry me a little bit. But I also think there are musicians in this century who are making a lot of great music. So musically speaking, you know, I think there's a lot of great stuff that's happening. I worry that we are increasingly both tuning it out and not even giving it a chance.
Yeah, and with all these new technologies of AI, we'll soon have music piped into us and we won't have any choice. We'll be listening to Because the Night until we die. Maybe we'll never die and we'll have the terrible torture of having to listen to Because the Night for infinity. Finally, David, let's end on a high positive note. You mentioned that there are some artists. You're a music journalist. You get to listen to a lot of interesting stuff. Give our audience two or three examples of new music that isn't from the 80s or 90s or even the 2000s that they could be listening to that's good, and that they should be not stealing or even listening on Spotify, but maybe paying for and even going to the concerts.
Yeah, no, that's the right thing to underscore. There's an artist called Soccer Mommy, and
Soccer
Mommy's just put out a new album called Evergreen, and I think that is a whole lot of beautiful music. There's such a clear and well-realized sound with this artist, so I'm very high on that band. Or it's a singer. It's all her music, so I don't know if it's right to say them or her. I think the National is a terrific band. I think they've made some of the best new music of this century. So I'm very high on them. I think, Jack White has just released an album a few months ago, and I'm knocked out by that album. It basically goes by the title No Name, because it doesn't really have a name. And that album is so raucous and just, it's the best. It's a White Stripes album that never got made. Basically, that's how it sounds to me, and it is so vital. So that albums like that make me very hopeful. So there's a lot of great music out there. We have to both be intentional about seeking it out and just giving it a full chance. And it's a balance. It's like I listen to so much music from the period in which I grew up in, but I have a healthy balance, and it's important to me to listen to that music, but also to what's being made today.
Yeah, I think you may be right. I mean, maybe what we should be waiting for from one of the great acts, from Dylan or Springsteen or the Rolling Stones or the Beatles, or the one Beatle or the two Beatles who are left, is for them to say, no one can use our music. We're tearing it up. We're burning it. And you're never going to get to hear it again. And that would be probably the best thing that could happen to our culture, wouldn't it?
That would be a very radical act. And that is never going to happen.
Not even from Joni Mitchell?
Nope.
Not the Sex Pistols? I think the few Sex Pistols that are left.
No, because those artists, those artists want their legacy. I mean, that's part of why they've sold their back catalogs the way they have. They want, it's important, and this, I don't say this with any judgment, but they want to be remembered for the music they created. They want generations to discover their music well after they're gone. And if and it's like, well, who can blame them?
Who can blame them? That's The Endless Refrain from David Rowell. Really important and interesting new book. Memory, nostalgia, and the threat to new music. We want new music. We want new culture, David. And congratulations on the new book. We will talk again soon. This subject is not going away. What you working on next?
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I'm doing some readings now for this book. And I am slowly starting to hone in on what the next book might be.
Can I step on the scene? I'm